Okay, the pattern we've laid out for doing historical inquiry is, as we've said in previous video, first to understand to gain a knowledge of as much as you can about the historical context. Then you go to the source material, taking that knowledge of context with you. So the assigned text for this week is part of Plato's Republic, which was written in the 4th century BCE, toward the end of what's called the Classical Age in Greece. But there's a lot of context that informed that text, right? Plato did not write this in a vacuum. He was well aware of things that were going on, things that had happened in Greece. He was critical of the decisions made by some of his fellow Athenians and some of the institutions and structures that existed in the Athens of his day, right, that had been put into place in previous periods. And so I'm going to try to give what I think are the most essential details here. This might take a couple of videos to do this justice, and hopefully that will give you a really good sense of, kind of how to interpret this and what Plato's responding to and those sorts of things. The first bit of context that I'd like to discuss is this institution that the Greeks called the polis. Polis is usually translated as city-state. Almost the entire Greek-speaking world, there were some exceptions which were kind of collective agrarian communities and things like this, but most of the Greek-speaking world in ancient times was divided into city-states. A city-state is a major population center surrounded by farmland that kind of feeds the entire population. And people kind of come and go between the countryside and the city, and there's a symbiotic relationship that exists between the two. Most city-states in ancient Greece were quite small. There were a few exceptions. Athens was as large as roughly the state of Rhode Island, and Sparta was probably 2 or 3 times that size in territory. Athens, though, had a much larger population than Sparta did, right? And there were a couple of other polis. Polis is the plural, by the way, of polis. Or a couple of other polis that were fairly large in area and or population. Okay, but most of these are small. The Greeks thought of themselves primarily with association to their polis, meaning their primary identity was not as a Greek, although that was something that they conceived of, but rather as an Athenian or a Spartan or a Megarian or a Corinthian or a Theban or, whatever it was, whatever their polis was. The polis itself, whichever one we're talking about, tended to have a cohesion both socially and culturally. There was an established system of social and political organization. Each polis had its own unique culture. Although there was a shared culture across the whole Greek-speaking world, each one had its own particular take on kind of the Greek way of life. And there was a tremendous amount of diversity. The origins of the Western concept of citizenship really go back to the Greek world. That's because at least a significant part of the population, the adult male landowners who were free, that is, they were not enslaved, were considered in most Greek polis full citizens. They had duties and obligations to the polis. They also had privileges that were part of that. Okay, there was a great deal of competition between polis. In the Greek-speaking world, there was a lot of warfare between city-states because the farmland was relatively scarce. Greece, the Greek world anciently, or in and around the Aegean Sea, and Greek settlements in other areas of the Mediterranean, were built on islands and peninsulas that were formed by volcanoes. Much of this was mountainous, and the farmland was relatively scarce. So there was a lot of competition over territory, and this could mean, survival or not surviving, starving to death. The one success in warfare and the amount of land that allowed the polis to procure was absolutely vital. You can see here in the background of the image, or the background of the slide, an artistic rendering of what is called the hoplite phalanx. This was the main military formation the Greeks used. This is a formation where the soldiers, and these would have been citizen soldiers. The Greeks did not have professional armies or standing armies. These would have been, entirely made up of citizens. But they held these large round shields. They wore some amounts of armor and a helmet and things like that. They carried a spear, but the shield is the really important thing, okay? All of the soldiers in the phalanx stood together in tight pack formation. They would advance, and whichever phalanx had greater strength, part of it was the larger the population, the more soldiers they could potentially choose from to strengthen their phalanx, right? And so numbers and strength were both absolutely vital things in this. It was not just the elites who did the fighting, unlike in some other societies in the ancient and medieval worlds. All of the citizens had to do their part if called upon, right? To fight in the army to try to procure more land so that they could thrive rather than sort of face starvation, right? So competition was endemic. Some poles obviously had greater success than others in military matters. Some of them became, like Sparta in particular, became highly militaristic. Poles experimented over the course of what's called the Archaic Age, from roughly 800 BCE to about 500 BCE, with different forms of government. Most of them began that period as monarchies of a sort, okay? We read about in the Odyssey, for instance, the question of, now that Odysseus has been gone for 20 years from the city-state of Ithaca, who's presumably not coming back, although, of course, he does come back in that story, who's going to take leadership of the polis? And that's because there was a system of the war chieftain, the most prominent warrior tended to become like a king. Now, to say the word king is perhaps too grand for what was really happening in these small city-states, but they did have some form of monarchy. And then often the strongest warriors would also be the greatest landholders, and they would form a kind of aristocracy. In fact, the Greek word aristoi means the best, all right, the best ones. But they had to recruit not just the best, but what the Greeks called the mesoi, the middling ones, okay, who wanted a say in government in exchange for fighting in the hoplite phalanx, risking their lives, even though they did not have as much land as others. And so this is what leads to a great degree of citizen involvement and ultimately to things like governments of elected magistrates, oligarchies, right? Government by a few, usually elected kind of representative magistrates, and citizen assemblies and things like this. In Athens, due to a number of factors that we need not get into here, the Athenians, really kind of alone among all the Greeks, at least initially, formed the world's first democracy. And by that we mean not that everyone had the right to vote or hold office, but rather it was still adult men who were freeborn and native to Athens. But Athens removed the property qualification. In pretty much every Greek polis, apart from Athens, one had to own property or land in order to be considered a citizen and to get a magistrate, to be eligible for a magistrate position, to be involved in citizen assemblies and such, okay? In Athens, one did not have to own property, at least from about the beginning of the 5th century BCE on. And that's an important factor in Athens. When we talk about Plato's Republic, we need to be aware of what the structures of the Athenian government were and the structures of the society were. So one, of course, important thing to realize is this was a form of limited democracy. And it was a direct democracy, too. Everyone who was a citizen, meaning anyone who was adult, male, freeborn, native-born, could attend the citizen assembly and vote on the matters of the day. There were not elected representatives to that body. It was anyone who was a citizen. So, this is one of the things that Plato is kind of responding to in writing the Republic. The Greeks did have a sense of Greekness that was a part of their identity, and there were institutions that helped to reinforce this. The Greek language was shared among them, and the Greeks were pretty kind of uppity about their language. They felt that it was superior, that it was the language of intellect, right? Anyone who didn't speak Greek, they considered a barbarian. That was a word that was onomatopoeic. To the Greek ear, a non-Greek language didn't sound like talking at all. It just sounded like people were going bar, 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 which is where the word barbaros comes from, the ones who go barbar. And so those are the barbarians, right? The Greek language did unify people and give them a sense of kind of commonality within the Greek world. There were a number of religious festivals that drew Greeks from all over the Greek-speaking world. The most prominent of these was held at Olympia, dedicated to the god Zeus, and among other things, at this religious festival, they would hold competitions of athletes, right? This is where the famous Olympic Games originated. And there were key other religious institutions like the Temple of Delphi, where this famous prophetess called the Oracle of Delphi lived. Greeks from all over the world, Greek-speaking world, would come to consult the oracle, to ask her advice on things, and it seems the oracle gave pretty good advice, probably because the priests who worked at that temple were engaging people in conversation, listening to what was going on, gathering information, and thus coming up with answers that became self-fulfilling prophecies, but that were drawn from good information. All right, so those are some of the key broader contextual points. I want to move on in the next video and talk about Athens and a little bit about Sparta, because these, of course, are the immediate context that Plato is responding to or thinking about in the Republic.